Great, why don't we get started? Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. And today we are having a presentation on Vermont Conservation Design for Landowners, given to us by Andy Wood from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, who is a habitat protection scientist. I'll let Andy tell us a little bit about himself and jump right into this wonderful tool that the department has developed as we look at keeping a connected habitat for wildlife throughout the state of Vermont.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to see some familiar names on the program. I'm Andy Wood. Some of you may know me from some previous work I did in the community wildlife program. Now working at a different program in the department, but really pleased to be here to talk about our work on Vermont conservation design and how this applies to those of us who own or manage land. So I've got about a 45-minute presentation here. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint and then leave a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A and discussion. So definitely let me know what you're thinking when we get there to the Q&A.
And while Andy pulls up his screen, I'll remind you, just type your questions in the chat box as you have them throughout, just so you don't want to forget them. And I'll have the conversation with Andy and read your questions at the end of the presentation.
Lisa, how does that look?
Perfect.
All right, so thanks again, everybody, for taking the time to be here. Today, the focus is Vermont conservation design for private lands. And I did want to note that while we're going to focus mainly on private lands, we use Vermont conservation design in a bunch of other contexts. So if any of you are involved in, say, like a town planning a conservation commission, we have folks who are available at the department to help you think about it in that lens. I'm happy to be a conduit to other contacts in the department. So feel free to get in touch and I'll put my email at the end of this presentation. But I want to kick this off with a little bit of story. A couple of years ago, I received a message from a landowner named Tim who had attended one of my talks. And Tim, who was actually a Coverts cooperator, said to me, you know, I've got this piece of land. I really want to make it better for wildlife and for the environment. What do I do? Where do I start? And what steps can I take along the way? And we get this question a lot. People want to do right by the land, but they're not exactly sure how to plug in and what the latest conservation science might say about the various resources they have on their property. So my hope through this talk is to put some additional tools in your toolbox through the lens of Vermont conservation design, which is really a resource to help you understand how your land fits into the bigger conservation scene and what you can do to apply it on the ground and get better conservation outcomes on your land. Just a couple words about where I'm coming from. At the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, we believe in the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. We have a really broad mission. It charges us with the conservation of all wild living things, from plants and insects to fish and wildlife and the habitats, natural communities, and landscapes they depend upon. We also serve all people in Vermont, including hunters, anglers, wildlife watchers. We help towns and landowners looking to improve habitat on their properties and in their communities. And we also look to the future to make sure that wildlife and wild places that we have will still be here for our kids and their kids. One of the ways that we fulfill our mission and serve Vermonters is by doing what I like to call conservation science. And these are projects that incorporate field work with all kinds of species and habitats. Sometimes we do advanced computer analysis, data modeling, all manner of sort of science projects. But the end result are maps, models, and outreach materials that help us translate science into action on the ground. And one of our flagship conservation science projects is Vermont Conservation Design. When we look back over the history of this project, virtually everyone in our department has contributed to it, and we've had vital contributions from many partner organizations. In fact, COARSE is currently helping us with one of the latest updates that we're doing on the project. Vermont Conservation Design, or as I'll call it, VCD, just to save breath, is at its heart a strategy to protect and enhance ecological function into the future. And what I mean by ecological function is the ability for plants and animals to interact as they need to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move, even while the climate changes beneath us. VCD, it's also a series of maps and data sets showing the most ecologically important lands and waters in Vermont, the places that we know are important for maintaining this ecological function. If we think back to our mission at the department, we're entrusted with protecting all of the species in Vermont. And our best estimates suggest there's somewhere between 24,000 and 43,000 species. We don't know the full number, and we know very little about many of these species. And so we just can't work efficiently on a species by species scale. We need a more practical method for protecting multiple species at the same time. In VCD, we use what's called a coarse filter conservation strategy. And if you sort of think about it as like a colander for pasta, we're going to be able to catch a lot of species and habitats in that coarse filter protection strategy. And to give you a more concrete example, if you protect a forest, the coarse filter idea says that you bring along most of the species that live in that forest, everything from the birds and amphibians down to the insects and fungi. Now, if you do that same coarse filter approach for all the other habitats in Vermont, our wetlands, our cliffs and rivers, the idea is that you'll bring along the majority of other species that live in those habitats. Now, we do know that this isn't the perfect strategy. Some species might slip through the holes of the colander and need some special attention to make sure that they don't slip through the cracks. We'll never get away with a fully coarse filter approach to conservation. We need both, but all in all, it's an effective way to do as much as we can with the limited resources that we have. The other big idea in VCD is that conservation needs to happen at multiple scales. We commonly refer to operating at the landscape scale, so thinking across mountains and valleys. We also talk about the community scale, thinking about a particular forest or lake or wetland. And then finally at that species scale, again, recognizing that some species need special attention and need that kind of laser focus of conservation action. So throughout this presentation, I'll share a couple thoughts about how you can take VCD and apply it at these different scales. To share this conservation science project with the public, we developed an online mapping portal called BioFinder to share the maps and the data that make up the conservation design. So you may hear, BioFinder and Vermont Conservation Design. You can think of it as Vermont Conservation Design is the info. BioFinder is the way we convey the info to the public. And all you need is a computer and an internet connection to get into BioFinder. You could, in theory, do it from your phone, but it's a lot easier from a desktop or laptop computer. And the URL to get there is biofinder.vermont.gov, and a standard Google search will get you there pretty quick too. So yes, this is a conservation science, but I also want to think about VCD as something that you should interact with through BioFinder. So you can't break it. Go there, click around, see how that place shows up with the various Vermont Conservation Design layers. And then I'd encourage you to share whatever it is you find with someone around you. Maybe it's a neighbor, someone else in your coverts cohort, or maybe it's a family member who you think might be interested in what it is that you're doing out in the woods all the time. So we'll come back to BioFinder later, but I'm going to take you through a couple different pieces of Vermont Conservation Design and share some thoughts about how you can apply it to private lands management. And I'm going to start at the landscape scale because that's sort of the first scale that I often introduce people to. So one thing that we wanted to dig into in VCD was this idea of interior forest condition. And a number of years ago, we mapped all the areas in Vermont that had contiguous natural cover that was unfragmented by roads, development, and agriculture. And so we came up with this map of largely the forest blocks in the state. And then we went through and we selected a subset of those that we thought had the best interior forest condition, looking at the statewide scope of all the lands in Vermont. And what I mean by interior is those forest blocks that have a greater amount of core area relative to their edge. And we knew that was important because we have some wildlife species that specialize on those forest interior habitats. We also know that those intact forest interiors help us with our air quality and our water quality protection goals. And we've come to understand that having forest interior helps keep forest resilient to some of the deleterious effects of climate change. So all in all, we made a map of those highest priority interior forest blocks shown here in purple. And you can see some patterns here. Most of our best interior forest blocks are along the spine of the Green Mountains or up in the Northeast Kingdom. But we also have some other strongholds elsewhere in the state. Now, when you think about this from your property, it may not show up, but that's not to say that the woods on your land don't have interior forest condition. At the local scale, they may be incredibly important. What's shown here is just our statewide top priorities from the state's perspective. Now, the goal for us as landowners and managers is to maintain the integrity of those forest blocks and to protect interior forest condition where we can. And mostly that's pretty simple. You know, it's all about reducing fragmenting features. So if we need to place a house site or a garage or whatever it is, do it on the edge of the block if you can, rather than punching a hole right in the middle of the forest block. We also know that forest integrity can be protected by managing invasive species and using sound silvicultural techniques. And Coverts has so many resources there on how to do right in that regard. What we want to avoid is this, where you have a forest block, as sort of shown here in this kind of orangey brown. These are areas that have been fragmented, and it doesn't mean that the forest block is gone or useless, but what's happened is that interior forest condition has been degraded by housing development and access roads. So it's kind of reshuffled that ratio of interior to edge in a way that's detrimental to some of our conservation goals. Now, there's another data set in VCD called connectivity blocks. And again, what we did was we took that initial forest block mapping project and we started to think about, well, how do you connect all these blocks together to get a continuous pathway of good quality habitat throughout the state? And again, here we're thinking at the statewide and beyond. So not only how do you keep habitat connected in Vermont, but how do you make a pathway from Massachusetts up to Quebec? Or how do you make a pathway from the Adirondacks across Vermont into northern New Hampshire? Our ecological goals here are to provide opportunities for wildlife to move and disperse as they need it. We know that a lot of genetic exchange can happen to keep our populations of wildlife healthy if they have that opportunity to roam as needed. We're also starting to understand that as the climate changes, we're seeing range shifts in species. So if they have the ability to disperse, whether they be wildlife or plants, along that continuous pathway of connected habitat, they are more likely to stay up or to keep up with climate change or maybe even stay a step ahead. That map is shown here in the orangey yellow. And again, we see a lot of the same areas identified as interior forest as also providing connectivity function. There are some additional blocks in here that serve as those valuable stepping stones. They may not be the biggest block, but they might sit in a very strategic location that links together different habitat blocks throughout the state. So how does this touch down on a single property? Well, let me take you through a couple different dimensions. What I showed you in the previous slide was connectivity in a more horizontal dimension, thinking to the east, west, north, and south. But you might also consider elevational connectivity, so connecting uplands with lowlands. We know that many species move upslope and downslope seasonally. And so, you may not have a mountain like this in your property, but you might have something to the tune of, 100 feet elevational difference in your property. And you might think about whether or not connectivity occurs across that elevational gradient. There's also a lot of opportunity here if you are working in tandem with some of your neighbors. You might have a greater capacity to address this kind of connectivity. Lakes and ponds are also deserving of connectivity, and you can think about this as circumferentially around the edge of the pond, but you might also think about it elevationally from the water line up to the habitat upslope of the water line. So this will give you not only benefits for plant and wildlife habitat connectivity, but it will also provide water quality and erosion control benefits. My family has a camp in Maine. Actually, we're headed over there real soon. And there's a spirited discussion about where the lawn should end and where the blueberries should begin. So it's, there's room for improvement everywhere, and something that we argue spiritedly about. Overall, what we're really looking for is more of this kind of connectivity as shown here on the right, and less of this here shown on the left, where they're mowing all the way down to the edge of the lake. But this connectivity can happen at smaller scales. And I like to show this picture because people love stone walls, but if you're thinking from a small mammal perspective, this might be a really neat connectivity corridor for small mammals. And if you've got a game camera, go out and set it up parallel to one of these stone walls, and you're bound to see some interesting stuff. So this is especially applicable for folks who might have smaller properties. Be thinking about fence lines, hedgerows, and other sort of small connectivity features. For many more folks, the best opportunity for connectivity happens streamside. And going back to our landowner, Tim, who I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a photo from a site visit to Tim's land in Shrewsbury. And you can see here, they've got this gorgeous stream, this lovely mowed path next to it. Well, one of the best enhancements Tim can make here is to just simply change the mowing practice to back off the stream a little further. And that would allow riparian vegetation to regrow and provide cover for wildlife that might be moving along the edges of this stream. For those of you who are interested in fish, that would also provide co-benefits for fisheries. The more woody vegetation you have, the more shade it sheds on the stream, and the better sort of cooling process you get there. So that would be a passive way to enhance riparian connectivity. You could jumpstart that process and think about a restoration planting by putting in some native shrubs and trees that are adapted to be in that sort of setting. So, things like willows, alders, perhaps some dogwoods. And then in the long game, what you'll also get added back into this stream is dead woody material that would come off of that regrown riparian woody vegetation. And we know that dead wood is a missing component that through centuries of management has been removed from a lot of our streams. So those are some ideas to think about connectivity on your property. And if you are interested in that riparian dimension, I'd encourage you to check out a data set in Vermont Conservation Design called Surface Waters in Riparian Areas. So this is, again, one of our mapping products where we took all of the lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, the riparian zones, and also the valley bottoms in which those stream geophysical processes occur. And we map those across Vermont, and it's difficult to sort of see here at the scale, but you can really see an amazing spider web of stream coverage from the uplands down to the lowlands, feeding into our lakes and rivers. So that's a really neat data set for you to explore, and one that can help you kind of understand not only where those riparian opportunities exist, but where the water goes when it leaves your property, or where it originates before it comes into your property. So here's a screenshot from the Surface Waters and Riparian Areas data set. You can see that feeder network of streams coming from the highlands here down into the lowlands. And you can see here, this is that valley bottom mapping along the Otter Creek. This is Tim's property right here to the left of my arrow. And so you can see that Tim's pretty close to the headwaters of, I believe that's Coolidge State Forest. And after the waters pass through Tim's property, they head down and join the Otter Creek down in the valley bottom. So again, just a different way to look at your property and think about your property's contribution to the larger conservation network. Now, one other type of landscape component in VCD I want to mention is called physical landscape diversity. And this is some of our emerging science that's started to show that one way to protect biodiversity is to protect the diversity of geology and soils and landforms underneath it. We found that there is a correlation between the degree of physical landscape diversity and associated biodiversity. And so by protecting that physical diversity, not only will we have a coarse filter strategy for protecting many species, but we also think that as our species shift during climate change, the ones that come and replace them will have some opportunity here on a physically diverse landscape. So that's a data set you can use to poke around and see what's what on your property. Some folks might find that they have calcium-rich bedrock, and we know that that supports a diversity of plant species with its nutrient-rich properties. Other folks might find that they have sandy soils left over from the glaciated period. That too often has an association with biodiversity. Or it might just be as simple as knowing that you've got a rocky outcrop or a cool ravine in the back 40 that provides variety to the northern hardwoods around. So that's one to explore, and something that we're working hard to kind of bring to bear on our conservation planning. So this is Tim's property. And there's a lot of opportunity for landscape scale conservation. We've looked at it through the lens of VCD, and that can help establish some priorities for Tim to consider. So we learned that there were opportunities on this property to protect forest integrity and interior forest condition. As you can see, this property's not too far from the spine of the mountain, so there might be some elevational connectivity at play here. We know that the riparian network is important, and we've already talked about opportunities for improvement along that riparian corridor. And I haven't dug into it, but there may be additional opportunities present through the lens of physical landscape diversity. We'll come back to Tim's property once more before the end of the presentation. So that was a short tour of several of the landscape components in VCD. We also have quite a bit more when we zoom down to the community and species scale. We have data sets on natural communities, aquatic habitats, our rare and uncommon species. That's including our threatened and endangered species data. Excuse me, we have wildlife road crossings, vernal pools, wetlands, and also some data on caves and mines, although that's somewhat protected to shield our sensitive bat species. So each of these can be explored in great depth in BioFinder. Unfortunately, we don't really have time in a short hour to get into each of them. So what I thought I'd do is I'd take you to a different property to explore how some of these finer scale elements, those community and species scale elements, come together. So we've left Shrewsbury and now we've gone to New Haven. This is Treleven Farm, home of Cheryl and Don Mitchell. And I met this couple a number of years ago on a property tour where they were showing some of the habitat work they'd done. And I had the chance to chat with them maybe about a year or two ago. And one of the things that they shared was that they had really taken to heart this principle that a healthy ecosystem is a diverse ecosystem. And they wanted to use that as a sort of a guiding principle for how to be better stewards of their property. One of the first things that they were doing here was thinking about, well, how do we heat our home? We've got this woodlot, maybe we can go out and get some firewood and do that in a way that takes into consideration the context of this land. Well, as it turned out, one of the trees that you'd find out in Cheryl's woods is the shagbark hickory. This is a tree that as it matures, the bark peels into long flakes of bark. And those flakes can provide dry crevices for bats to roost under, including many of our threatened and endangered species. So just as a simple action like harvesting wood can be done, taking into consideration that species and community concept, and simply by avoiding harvesting those mature shagbarks, Mitchells can be engaged in conservation, and that's what they did. When we look at their property, what I've got up here first is the purple is that interior forest block layer I talked about earlier. So you can see that their their woods are mapped as one of those highest priority interior forests. And that doesn't mean that they can't or shouldn't do forest management. It just means that they keep using that kind of conservation minded approach when they do plan a harvest in their forest. Now, when we start to add some of the community and species scale components on top, it starts to show a really cool convergence. So this is the natural community layer shown here. You can see that not only is this area interior forest, but there's a state significant natural community there as well. Next, I've turned on the aquatic habitats and the wetlands layers. So the wetlands is this dark blue, the aquatic habitats is this lighter blue of the river. And then as it turns out, we have some rare, threatened, and endangered and uncommon species data from the area. So what you're seeing here in BioFinder is through the different layers of Vermont Conservation Design, there's a convergence of different elements that tell us this place is special. This place has extra conservation value. And really that's kind of a cue to think that, okay, we need to be taking all of these different components into consideration when we're choosing how to manage our land. Don and Cheryl really ended up going deep down the rabbit hole of bat habitat management in their property. And what they found through assistance from various biologists and programs was that not only could they keep their shagbarts, they could enhance them. So one of the things they could do was to increase the solar exposure on those mature shagbarks to make them even warmer and more attractive to bats. They also did quite a bit of work on managing invasive species to make sure that they could have regeneration of the next cohort of trees come up underneath these mature forests that they had. And then they realized that, well, maybe there's something we can do for bats here by managing for some of their foraging needs. So they're roosting in the trees, but when they head out to forage, they would head down over the meadows to the beaver wetlands and the ponds on the property. So that was a way they could think about this from a more community and landscape scale, in addition to those individualized species management goals. So they've done an incredible amount of work on the property, a real testament to what you can do with the right know-how and support. I think the big takeaway for me here is that, you know, sometimes you can isolate a project and work on it at a different scale, but often you understand its different parts and then you put them back together to manage with the bigger picture in mind. Okay, so in this next section, I'm going to just take you through some of the basic functions of BioFinder to give you a sense for what some of its capabilities are. And these are just screenshots. They're not live, but you are more than welcome to poke around simultaneously if you want. So when you open up a web browser and navigate to BioFinder, what you'll get is this sort of split screen framework where on the right, you've got a map viewer. You can zoom in and out to your desired destination. And then you've got all your map layers over here on the left. We've developed a layer called overall priorities, which lumps together all of the community, species, and landscape scales. But most folks find it helpful to look at these piece by piece, as I've done in this presentation. So you can open up the bucket of landscape components and play around with many of those layers that we've discussed, like interior forest, connectivity blocks, and physical landscape diversity. You can do the same for the community and species components. You would just click on that plus to open up the layers grouped together there. One of your best friends on BioFinder is the toolbar. There's a button over here in the top right corner. If you click on that, it pops open a toolbar on the top of the map portal. And it has a menu of different tools. So there's everything from map tools down to measurements. This allows you to do all kinds of things, even really simple things like measuring, well, how far is it from the edge of the house to the edge of the woods? You can do that in the measurement tool menu. I think another important tool to know about is the ability to click and identify what it is that you're seeing on the map. So in that toolbar, if you go over to the identify section and choose the point tool, That allows you to click on any feature that's displayed in BioFinder to see what it is that's depicted on the map. In this case, what I'm showing here is I had turned on the wetlands layer and the natural communities layer. And you can see that there's this area that's both wetland and natural community. And so I clicked on the natural community, that polygon that's kind of outlined in bright blue here. And here's what it says. It gives me the definition of a natural community. It tells me what it is. In this case, it's a northern white cedar swamp. And that's useful information to know that there's a swamp here as part of this wetland complex. My apologies for the coughing here. For those who want to go a little bit deeper and drill down into the data and its attributes, there's another tool that you can use called View Additional Data. So again, you start by selecting a feature. Here I'm in Moncton and I've selected a large wetland polygon that's mapped. And when this box pops up, there's a option here down in the bottom left that says View Additional Details. When you click on that, it opens a new pane here on the left. And I'll make this bigger in just a second, that shares the attributes of that wetland. So here's what shows up in that side pane. You can see that it's a wetland. It's classified as a class 2 wetland under the Vermont wetland rules. Its size is about 291 acres. And it's been prioritized in Vermont Conservation Design as a highest priority feature. Those are kind of the key things to know about that wetland there, at least as you can see it in BioFinder. We also have tools to export data out of BioFinder. This is a little bit more advanced skill, but if you're a GIS user and you want to bring it into GIS, or if you're a spreadsheet geek like me, sometimes I'll bring data down into spreadsheets so I can, sort by different features. But the way you would do that is you'd make a selection, so you can click on a feature like that wetland or natural community. And then there's this, my colleague Jens calls this the hamburger button here in the Identify Results tab. If you click on that, it opens up an option to manipulate your data, and you can export it to various other programs. So again, if you're the GIS user, you can export it to a shapefile. If you're the Excel user, you can export it to an Excel file format. Or if you just want to see it in tabular data, you can do that. So I just mentioned that for some people, if you're a numbers person, that might be a helpful way to interpret the data that's on display. One of my most favorite and I think most useful tools for the average user is the ability to share what it is that you're looking at. And so in your toolbar, you can go to the Map Tools menu. And then these 3 buttons allow you to share a link, export it, or make a printable map that could then be shared via email. I generally recommend using the print button. As you click on it, it will create a nice, attractive map that displays whatever layers you have turned on in BioFinder. So in this case, I had natural communities, aquatic habitats, and wetlands turned on. You have the ability to change the title. So if you wanted to say, this is the wood property, you could have it read that. And then if you have any notes here, you can also modify that field. But being able to share a map is really useful, again, for sharing with other interested parties, whether they be family members, community members, neighbors, what have you. Finally, if you're interested in learning more about the project or downloading this data to your own computer, in the toolbar, you can go to the map data menu and you can download any of the data that's embedded here. And we did a big update, I think right around the beginning of 2020. So this is fairly recent. Each time we are able to do a revision of the project, we try to work our way all the way down through the data downloads and metadata for folks who really want to go deep in this project. So that's kind of a whirlwind overview of some of the tools. I'd encourage you to go check it out, play around. And if you need additional support, please get in touch with the department. We have a lot of resources that we've developed for BioFinder users. So a couple closing thoughts here. Thinking back to Tim's land, one of the things that impresses me most about Tim's story is it's not the acreage or the stream or the beautiful drone photo. It's really the dedication Tim has to sharing that knowledge with others. And we've been in touch loosely in recent weeks. And in addition to all the habitat enhancements that have happened there, one of Tim's other projects is working to help other landowners understand and bring carbon sequestration techniques to their land. And there's a good article in Northern Woodlands sort of showcasing that work. So for me, the takeaway is, yes, absolutely, habitat management and conservation planning is important. But there are other ways to take care of the land, and sharing stories and strengthening connections that we have and our peers and families and communities have is just incredibly important. For Don Mitchell, who I mentioned earlier, another way of sharing their story was through writing a book. And if you haven't seen Flying Blind, I'd encourage you to check out a copy of it when you get a chance. The front cover says it all. Flying Blind, one man's adventure battling buckthorn, making peace with authority, and creating a home for endangered bats. When I last spoke with Cheryl and Don, they also told me that one of the most rewarding developments on their land was hosting this forest preschool, Wren's Nest, and helping a next generation of kids rekindle a love for the land. And in their eyes, the way they shared it with me, that may be just as important as getting outside with your chainsaw, if not more important. So some final parting thoughts on users of Vermont Conservation Design. Take-home message is work at any and all scales you can. Even if you only have a backyard garden, that matters too. Second, share knowledge freely with those around you. Take what you've learned, pass it on. And finally, stay humble, work with humility. Well, for me, one of the greatest joys and surprises of being a scientist is periodically being reminded of how amazingly complex the world is. So I just try to encourage everybody to stay flexible, incorporate new knowledge when it becomes available, and try not to be like Calvin in this strip, who's lording over the flowers that he's about to water before getting caught in a downpour. Finally, if you've enjoyed today's presentation, I'd encourage you to support our work at the department by purchasing a habitat stamp or contributing to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. The majority of conservation funding comes from hunters and anglers, so please consider contributing to conservation in this way. The habitat stamp, it's not like a postal stamp, it's more like a sticker you can throw on your bumper or the bow of your boat. And of course, you're welcome to get in touch with me. Here's my email address. We have a host of talented colleagues at the department, many who are especially focused on private lands management. And we're happy to be of service and assist with whatever projects you have in mind. So with that, I'll open it up for questions and discussion.
That's great, Andy. Thank you so much. That was a great explanation of Vermont Conservation Design. You know, bringing it down to the landowner level is really important. And you couldn't have highlighted two better cooperators, but Don is also a COVERTS cooperator, and talking about the COVERTS mission of, you know, sharing and the knowledge in their land, which both of those have done their premier examples. So yeah, thank you so much for those words, because that's the mission of COVERTS, is really, it's a peer-to-peer organization. So it's really exciting for me because I had no idea you were highlighting either one of those. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks for the reminder. I had forgotten that Don and Cheryl were COVERTS alum as well. So good catch.
Yeah, no, I was just excited to see both of them in there. I had no idea you used them as your stories. I love storytelling for what we do. So I thank you for your expertise at that and providing those examples. Let me jump into the chat. There are a few questions. So one of the questions about the data itself is, do you happen to know the ratio of area to perimeter that defines an interior forest block?
This is an excellent question. I will need to go look at my notes. I don't have that on the tip of my tongue, but that is something that actually we're working on right now in the newest iteration of Vermont Conservation Design. I'd have to check back on exactly how we calculated it, but you know, generally writ large, the blockier or more circular you know, spatial arrangements of forests tend to have that greater ratio of interior to edge. If you have a real, you know, snaky orientation of habitat, you tend to have the higher edge to interior. But great question. Please send me an email if you want to follow up, and I'll dig back and try to get back to you.
So someone wants to know if there's a book or if they can get a copy of this conservation design. You know, where does it live? I mean, I know you kind of explained that, but I think a little more clarification then.
Absolutely, yeah. So the data itself is the best place to get it is from BioFinder portal. We also have a number of reports we've generated. We've done several different iterations of the project. So if you go to our department website and search Vermont Conservation Design, I'll get a link here in just a minute. You can access any of those different development reports, and it really lays out, you know, what our assumptions are, you know, what we were trying to do, and how we developed the design in the way that we did.
All right, great. Another question was, can landowners add their own information or upload information to BioFinder or for this map?
Yes, you can. There's a couple different ways to do it. One way is there's a set of tools called Draw. And so you could, let's say, for example, you just wanted to show the boundary of your property. Well, you could draw a polygon, you know, around the limits of your property, and then I'll just throw another example. Say you want to delineate some of the timber stands on your property. You could, again, draw the boundaries of those. Now you can take that drawing and you know, use it to overlay with the data. And if you want to save that, you can export your drawing, save it to your desktop, and then anytime you want to work with that data again, there's a way to bring it back in. So it sounds a little roundabout, but there are ways to add data for things that you might be considering in your management. There's also ways to add data through spreadsheets. So let's say if you have a list of, I don't know, GPS coordinates where you've planted some trees, and you want to you know, see how that lines up with some of our data. There is a way to load that up. These are a little bit kind of more advanced topics, but they can certainly be done, and we have folks who can support making that happen. I think Brian who was on the call had done some of that. Is that right, Brian? Maybe Brian left.
No, that's right, Andy. We've done some ash tree surveys here in town and had a lot of success uploading the GPS data stripped off of photographs, uploading that to BioFinder and creating an inventory of ash trees here in town. It's a great tool.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Brian. I remembered we were just emailing about that the other day.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing, Brian. Is that data though, once they upload it, it isn't uploaded into the Vermont Conservation Designs, it's uploaded for them to use? Do you actually have access to that data once it's uploaded, or is it just sort of more, they can upload data for their use? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, more the latter. You know, it doesn't become part of the data set. It's more ephemeral, so to speak. So you can use it for your own purposes. Really, the goal is to take our data from the state and put it in your hands.
I see.
You know, rather
Okay.
than you putting your data in our hands, although there are some cases where, you know, if you have a interesting natural community or rare species that you want to share that kind of information with the state, that then down the road could get incorporated into the next iteration of VCD if you're on board with that sort of data sharing.
Okay. What is the format of the map data that's downloaded from BioFinder?
You usually get a PDF. So it comes out, you go through the steps and it spits out a PDF into your downloads folder, and then you can easily share that through email, or you could put it on an external hard drive and share it with someone that way, or you could print it out.
Awesome. There aren't any other questions on that specifically. I do want to say, if you have data that you want to share or get information on, let's say it's an individual wildlife species you're seeing on your property, there are programs like iNaturalist that people can use. So there are a lot of citizen science programs and opportunities to share your data if that is something that you want to do. And we certainly can help you with that if you email myself, or I'm sure Andy, if he doesn't know, there's someone else at the department that does. Some of the different programs if you're interested in sharing data like that. And it also is a great way to learn things that are in your area, because you can search on those the same way you can search on VCD to find out what people are seeing in your area. So that's another tool. There's so many tools out there. It's kind of exciting. All right. If anybody has a last question to type in, go ahead and do that. So Andy, tell me a little bit about, I know you're involved in like the next iteration, the next update. When is that looking to be done?
Great question. So we have secured a grant to make an update to Vermont Conservation Design on, you know, not the whole thing, but some key components that are due for revision. And we'll be working on it through this year, and I believe we have funding into 2023. So when all is said and done, what you'll see is really an update to the BioFinder portal. So anything new that we create or anything that we update will get shared with the public through BioFinder. And I believe we will also create some sort of report outlining you know, the methods and results from that project. So that'll be a little bit down the road, but something you can look forward to. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to get in touch.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation today. We really enjoyed it. And I look forward to diving into more into BioFinder and VCD. And I hope all of you do as well. It's a great tool if you're a landowner. And I think Andy gave us some great tools as landowners to try and kind of really look at these data. It can be a little overwhelming, but just like you said, you're not going to break anything. Keep clicking around and checking it out.
Well, thanks for inviting me here, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to be a part of this. You know, we couldn't do our conservation work without the help of landowners and organizations like Covered. So we're grateful and excited to partner with folks down the road.
All righty, everybody have a great afternoon. Happy summer.
Thank you.